and I'm the communications lead for the LANDFIRE team with the Nature Conservancy. Thanks for joining us today and for dealing with us as we pause to try to get our audio pulled together. We put a little questionnaire up on the screen right now and hope you'll take just a second to answer the questions. We like to track how you find out about our webinars and how we can get more information to you and the way you like to get it. So take another 10 seconds or so and click in, and then I'll ask Jack to pull the screen, set the screen so that we can start the webinar itself. So take a second and fill it out if you haven't already. Okay, Jack, can you pull that down and we can get going? All right. Here's your formal welcome to the LANDFIRE and Lake States Fire Science Exchange webinar. As I said, I'm Jeannie, and this is one of a series of webinars that LANDFIRE's been offering in partnership with the Fire Science Exchange Network. They look at LANDFIRE's Biophysical Settings Review Project. We do record and post them on LANDFIRE's YouTube channel. I know Jack's recording as well. And we publicize them through the LANDFIRE Bulletin. The link to subscribe, if you're not getting it already, is on the last slide. You'll have a good chance to get that information. Know that you can always write to us at landfire@tnc.org. Today's presenter is Randy Swaty. I know a lot of you know Randy. He is an ecologist with the Nature Conservancy's LANDFIRE team. Randy joined the Michigan chapter in 2002 and LANDFIRE in 2007. Randy's worked with academia, federal partners, and owners of large landscapes to promote sustainable management practices, and he was the Great Lakes LANDFIRE modeling lead. He lives in Evanston, Illinois presently, and is one of the ecologists who's leading the Biophysical Settings Review. Today he's going to cover the review. He'll tell you what it is, how it works, why it's important, and use examples from the Lake States region. So go ahead, Randy, it's all yours.
Thanks, Jack and Jeannie, for the introductions, and thanks to everyone that's on the webinar today. Again, apologies for the audio issues, but I think we're up and going. So today, as Jeannie mentioned, we're going to talk about our biophysical settings and a review process that's underway right now. But I want to say right off the bat, as Jeannie mentioned, we're always around to help you use LANDFIRE data. We're always keen to get your input, and we're going to be providing links to you all later because we don't expect you to try to erase and write everything down. But please know that we're keen to help you out along the way with LANDFIRE. So today I'm going to go over these things called biophysical settings and talk about our modeling. I'm going to talk about why we're doing this biophysical settings or BPS review. I'm going to talk about how you can jump in and help if you have time, and then give you some links and ideas on how to learn more about LANDFIRE. So most of you have probably heard of LANDFIRE, but in case you haven't, here's sort of the basic verbiage about LANDFIRE. And this comes from the website landfire.gov. And what I would like you to think about is the words I have bolded. You know, we update these incredible data sets. We have a consistent process for mapping fire, fuels, and vegetation data across the country. And also I want you to know that we've split out land and fire a bit. I hate to admit it, but I am not a fire person. I really respect the work you guys do, but I'm more of a vegetation ecologist, and I often find myself working in northern hardwoods forests, which have a fire return interval of maybe 2,000 years. So LANDFIRE not only maps fire and fuel characteristics, but also vegetation characteristics. As you'll hear today, while I personally think it's a pretty amazing set of data and models and tools, we know it's not perfect, and we're always working to improve things. And that's why we're asking for your help. So I'll be going into this in more detail later on, but with our models and descriptions, why would we want to review? There's a lot of reasons. One, we're finding some typos and just kind of superficial, but still important blunders, we call them. There's tons of new science out there since we first delivered the models about 8 years ago now. I know I missed some opportunities with the Great Lakes Modeling League to connect with some of you to get your input on the original models. And I think all of us on the Nature Conservancy's LANDFIRE team feel that way. And we have updated software that we're using now that is much more capable. And with that, what are these models? What are these descriptions? So they describe how our ecosystems looked and worked prior to major European settlement. So I should have mentioned a couple of slides ago, LANDFIRE is a large project. You probably saw the logos, but it's a large project with Department of Interior, Department of Ag, and the Nature Conservancy. So our role was to describe and model how all the ecosystems of the United States would have looked and worked prior to European settlement. Then the rest of the LANDFIRE team mapped that out. So we wanted to do this so we would have a reference to compare current conditions to. And I should have put some more text in bold there. You know, we're not doing this to say this is what you guys need to do. We do this to provide information and context. You guys decide what should be done. We provide background and information. We got these models descriptions done by working with hundreds of people like you in workshop settings, via the internet, via email, whatever we could do to get information. And then we had a sort of a QA/QC process, and we also sent those models and descriptions out for review. So we delivered roughly 2,000 models in 2008. And you see here that we delivered, you know, roughly 200 to 400 pages of documentation and associated models every 2 weeks. LANDFIRE National was an unbelievable effort. From the outside, it probably looked like it was going very slowly, but internally it was amazing as mappers were mapping billions of pixels per day, and we were sending in tons of information. So with that, it was amazing, but we know there's room for improvement. As I mentioned, we have new information. I wanted to just call out a few things that I know of. Several papers by Corus, Goebel, and others were super relevant to our northern pine oak and other pine ecosystems. I've been working with people in Wisconsin already, and they brought up some of these papers, and we've been making some what I think are great improvements to the models there. There are also new papers in the northern hardwood forests, wetlands. Every ecosystem has new papers since we first sent these models out. And there are also some regional publications and reviews by folks like Greg Nowacki. So we know we can bring this information in and make the models work together better and be better on their own. Also, this is important because the LANDFIRE Biophysical Settings models are linked to several spatial data sets. LANDFIRE delivers vegetation data, both historic and current. We deliver historic fire regimes. We do not deliver anything analogous to a current wildfire risk map, though our data sets are used to create those. We deliver fuels and disturbance data, which is pretty amazing. And so we have a lot of topographic data sets as well. The vegetation, historic and current, and historic fire regime data sets, in one way or another, are linked to the biophysical settings data that we'll talk about. So I'm going to spin through a few graphs, and all I did with these, or maps, excuse me, all I did was I took the national grids of these LANDFIRE data sets, and I clipped them by the ecoregions that make up the Lake States Fire Consortium. So you see a little thin strip there going up to the northeast. That's how your border works. So I just did that for fun. And so you can see what was going on here. I can tell you the purples and lavenders and the blues are wetland ecosystems, which we have tons of. The greens range from northern hardwoods to pine oak ecosystems. We have some jack pine barrens and some of the other types of barrens and some of the darker reds and pinks. So I didn't put a legend on here because it would have been very unwieldy, and I wanted to basically show you the patterns that you see with LANDFIRE data. Here's a one. We deliver LANDFIRE mean fire return interval, and it's broken up in 10-year increments. And I just picked a color scheme, which sort of, what this does is interesting. It sort of masks some of the higher fire return interval or lower fire return interval BPSs in Upper Peninsula, for example. But trust me, if you zoom in here, you see a lot more fire than is indicated by my color scheme that I picked for this. However, you also do note the grasslands to the southwest that would have burned very frequently. You sort of see the patterns a little better here possibly, where in the eastern Upper Peninsula, for example, you see more fire. This LANDFIRE fire regime group is as a system of 5 categories that capture frequency and severity of fire. So the past map was mapping all fires, whether it's surface, mixed, or replacement, and this separates that out a bit. Again, call me. Let's look into this in more detail, but I wanted to just show you what the patterns look like. Also, LANDFIRE delivers succession classes, and we'll go into those in a fair bit of detail today, but for each biophysical setting, we broke those ecosystems, if you will, up into 5 or fewer succession classes representing developmental stages characterized by the species composition, height, and cover. And so this is a representation of what's on the ground today. The grid by itself does not mean a whole lot. It just is labeled A, B, C, D, E, and our agriculture groups. But if you link this up with the biophysical settings map, then you can get a great picture of what things are looking like on the ground today. Also, that map of succession class is compared to our reference conditions to give you a map of ecological departure. And I show this with some hesitation, some pride, some hesitation. This map is easily sort of can be alarmist because it looks like there's tons of brown, and people look at the northern hardwoods and they say, why is that departed? There's, you know, that's not a fire-dependent ecosystem. But I would say it's not about fire necessarily. It's about the structure and composition of the northern hardwoods. So this is a data set that you drill into to learn more about how your ecosystems compare to our reference ecosystems. So as you might imagine, getting the reference conditions right has a big bearing on this particular data set. So as I mentioned, the biophysical settings model and description bundles are linked to several spatial data sets. The spatial data sets are not perfect, but if we can get the models better, that can improve the spatial data sets. And we're going to go into those models now. So as I mentioned before, this is a repeat of the slide I had. I think it's okay to repeat. These biophysical settings, again, mapped what would have been on the ground under natural disturbance regimes based on soils, superficial geology, climate, and other abiotic factors with an introduced disturbance parameter as well. We did this to paint a picture of what things would have looked like under natural disturbance regimes. I mentioned a bundle. So with each particular biophysical setting, we have a description that's pretty thorough, covers geographic range, the abiotic factors that would have governed where the ecosystems would have been, the disturbance regime. Then importantly, they also go into the succession classes that I mentioned earlier. The disturbance information and succession class information was put into a state and transition ecological model. We used to do this in Vegetation Dynamics Development Tool, also known as VDDT. Now we use a program called STSIM. It's just a modern, more evolved, more sophisticated, and easier to use version of VDDT. So these descriptions cover the basics, as you see here, and as I mentioned before, a lot of information. So this is an example by Greg Nowacki covering the north central and interior dry oak forest and woodland. Pretty amazing amount of information in these documents. So you'll see at the top, you can click through those tabs. If you're working in the Access database, we affectionately known as the Model Tracker database, you can get the succession class information, the height and cover, the disturbances, and relative literature. When we first did our work, we collected it like you see here in an Access database that is available on the landfire.gov website. However, we used Python scripts to extract that information, pull it into Adobe Acrobat PDF files. And now, if you were to help us with the review, you can work in Microsoft Word. So we've tried to make it as simple and easy as possible. But you may want to review this ecosystem and you may say, well, you know, I can add some specificity to the geographic range. You know, I can add in more information to make this more valuable. Or you may want to add in some information in the uncharacteristic native conditions text box. Here, Greg was fairly thorough, as he usually is, and he talked about red maple that would come into this particular BPS in the absence of fire. We're seeing this as a major issue across our oak ecosystems in the east. So, but you may want to add more information here in this box. Here's a view of what the succession classes look like. So they're labeled A, B, C, D, and E, which is just to track the information. Obviously, there's nothing of ecological value in an A or a B. However, if you dig into the succession classes, you'll see that they're characterized by canopy closure and height, which I have circled over on the right. So the prairie succession class would have, you know, herbaceous vegetation up to 1.1 meters, and then Greg also has some species in there. There's room for another one if you want to add one. If you look down to class B, you see that this is more the savanna, which has, Greg has canopy cover of 11 to 20%, and those, so it would be trees. He took this from a Curtis publication, which goes through and labels what is a prairie, what's savanna, what's woodland, what's forest. I believe he used those cutoffs. So while we did not map succession classes historically, assuming they moved around, we used those rule sets that I've circled to map where the succession classes are today. So did you notice in the previous slide how we have landscape percent? I'm gonna draw for fun here. So we have these landscape percents. This is how much of this particular biophysical setting we would have expected to occur in each of the succession classes under natural disturbance regimes. So as you might imagine, in some of the oak biophysical settings, we would have had even more fire than this one had, and we might have more prairie or more savanna. If I remember right, this is the dry mesic, not the dry oak biophysical setting. So where do we get these percentages? We modeled those out using Vegetation Dynamics Development Tool. So if you would have asked me about modeling before I joined LANDFIRE, I would have said, no way, I can't do it. That's for postdocs or people who spend their careers parameterizing things. I quickly found that's not the case. This software makes it pretty easy. So what we did was we went into the dialog box for each one of these squares, which represent succession classes, and we defined the age range of the succession class. We put in a generic open, closed, or all canopy structure label. But most importantly, we defined succession, or what would happen if you didn't have disturbance. So if this prairie stage went 5 years without a disturbance, it would succeed to this savanna stage. If the savanna didn't have a disturbance for 50 years, it would move on to this woodland stage, and so on. Then we also modeled in the disturbances. So this circle here represents surface fire that would have kept Class C, the woodland, into Class C. We could have had flooding, fever, herbivory, wind weather stress, pests, hurricanes, tornadoes. We modeled any natural disturbance regime that we had information for. And as you might expect, some natural disturbance regimes we have more information for than others. We always want more fire regime information, but compared to insects, we have a lot more fire regime information than we do natural insects. At least that's what I've found. So we put in the probability of any cell or pixel having one of these disturbances. Then we ran the model. So we ran the model for 1,000 years. And this was not because we were trying to go back in time 1,000 years. That was really not the case. But we ran the model 1,000 times so that things could equilibrate over time. And you'll see that in the graphs below. When we started out, we used the same percentages for each succession class because we didn't know the succession classes historically. We just gave them equal representation. Then we ran the model 1,000 years, and that was how we determined how much of the succession class, of each succession class we would have on the landscape under natural disturbance regimes. We ran the model, again, for 1,000 years, 10 times a piece for 1,000 cells to give us a pretty robust estimate of the succession classes. As you're probably putting together in your mind, getting the disturbance parameters is really important. We got that from expert opinion, from literature, from local data, whatever sources we could get it from. And we know those can be improved. There's been a lot of work in red pine, for example, since we did this first modeling effort. So as Jeannie mentioned, if you have any questions or comments, please write them in the chat box as we go along. And I'm going to pause for just a second and encourage you to type any questions. I've been I don't know, this seems like a lot of information to me. So please jump in if you have any questions, anything I can clarify. Okay, I don't see any questions coming in, so I'll keep going. So when we got all the models, got all the descriptions together, we sent them out for review. Some models, some descriptions got more review than others, as you might expect. We got the review information back. We incorporated it where we could, and we would go back to the original modeler and see if they were okay with that and work through a process to kind of resolve any conflicts there may have been between different people. We then did both automated and manual QA/QC to try to catch any particular errors. For example, maybe at first we were manually typing in the percentages from VDDT into our description document. We automated that to take away that source of error. And we just did a lot of QA/QC to try to catch the most obvious errors. But we know they're not perfect, and we know there's new information. So as I mentioned, we deliver these models and bundles every 2 weeks, and you can go to landfire.gov and get the models and the descriptions multiple ways. If you go to landfire.gov, see if I can draw again, and click on vegetation, the oval button at the top, you're going to find a hyperlink that says download model products. And what you can do is you can click on a map zone, maybe you're in map zone 41, and you can get a zip file that has a PDF file with all the descriptions for map zone 41 and the VDDT database you need to run the models in VDDT. We also have a master database with all the descriptions for the country. We provide not very much support for that database. It's pretty complex, but we'll try to help you with it if we can. It's my favorite way to look at the descriptions because you can do queries and you can quickly go through the tabs to get the information you're interested in. As I mentioned, we're now using STSIM. We also deliver a master database of all the models for the whole country that you would link to in STSIM. So you could play with models in Arizona or Maine or Florida or Hawaii or Alaska. The fun part of my job is getting to travel all over the country via these models, maps, and descriptions. So how are these BPS models and descriptions used? As I mentioned earlier, they're used in several of the mapping processes, but also they're used in conservation planning. For example, some of my favorite stories include conservation and modeling. I probably wouldn't have guessed that a geek with a model and a bunch of data set could bring people together, but we're finding increasingly that when you have a large landscape with many stakeholders, many competing interests, you can use the models in a collaborative learning setting to explore everyone's values and beliefs and come up with some solutions. For example, some partners may not want to do any treatment for a given forest. Other partners may want to do, a lot of treatment in a given forest. Then there's usually someone in between, and we can model those scenarios out to see what happens. Then we can go in and start playing around with different treatments. We can put a cost to the treatment. We can add in modern threats such as invasives or fire suppression. We can go in and play with these models and really explore things with people. I don't know how many of you guys are familiar with FSC or the Forest Stewardship Council, but if you read Principle 6, you would think possibly someone in LANDFIRE wrote it. They call specifically for a comparison of historic to current succession classes. I think they use a different word than succession classes, but it's essentially the same thing. They want it done at a landscape scale, which is often difficult because we don't have the data. Obviously, people are being certified using a lot of different ways to get at that, but LANDFIRE makes it pretty simple for you to deal with several of the indicators in Principle 6 of the Forest Stewardship Council certification. So here's the basic philosophy. The more people use LANDFIRE and discover its strengths and weaknesses and report those back to us, the better. The more that people help us with the review, the better. The more people submit plot information that guides a lot of our mapping, the better. It seems like a pretty direct correlation there. So we want people to use the data and provide us feedback. All right, so this is what we're working on now. As I mentioned, we delivered around 2,000 models and descriptions originally. Some of those biophysical settings would have an identical model and identical description across multiple map zones. All right, so maybe you have a model and description delivered for the northern pine oak in Minnesota, and you might have the same model and description delivered for northern pine oak in Wisconsin. We've lumped those together and cleaned up the model set that way, though we realize that we will probably need to split some of those back out. But if the information is exactly the same, we lump them together to sort of clean up our model set. We've posted all the documents, roughly 1,200 of them, to a dedicated review website. You see sort of the homepage below, and we'll send out that link, but it's basically landfirereview.org. And there, it's just a few clicks away to get a Word document of an ecosystem that may be of interest to you. And Jason has a great question that I'm going to address now, saying, are there any built-in assumptions about climate change? This is a great question for several reasons. I'm going to take the easiest answer to that first. Basically, LANDFIRE did not factor in any climate change. although there may have been climate change in the reference period or pre-settlement period. That said, and there are a couple boxes in the BPS descriptions where you could put in climate change information, and we welcome that. It wouldn't be used in a model because we're modeling the past, but it would be very helpful for users in the future who might go in and modify the models for their local use. So we tried to model the era just prior to European settlement. We weren't going back multi-thousands of years or looking at climate change patterns pre-settlement, which is, you know, there's been a big discussion about that, kind of sparked by a paper by Abrams and Nowacki not too long ago. So thanks for that question, Jason. The review will be incorporated into those Word documents and delivered via a website. If you have just any great ideas on how to deliver the BPS information in the future, we welcome those ideas. We're starting to craft that out. We like something that's super easy and intuitive for people to use. It's difficult. If you're simple, then you miss opportunities for searching and queries. But if you're complicated, you make it more difficult and prone to problems. So we're working on that balance right now. So I've kind of flown through things, but here are the connections for you to dig in and learn more. You can go to landfire.gov, which is the major program homepage run by our partners with the USGS, Forest Service, and others. We run the Conservation Gateway. We have a very active Twitter feed, which Jeannie procures. We have a YouTube channel with several tutorials. If you want to learn how to go in and work with our raster data sets, Corey Blankenship on our team has done a great job putting some videos up on that. We ask that you opt in to get our bulletins and postcards. We can't send you that information without you opting in. And also, as Jeannie mentioned, we have an email box, landfire@tnc.org. And also, as I mentioned before, our dedicated BPS review website is landfirereview.org. So with that, I hope that we can have a bit of a discussion. So please bring on the questions, and I'll do my best to answer them.
Hi, this is Jeannie again. Can you guys hear me?
I can.
All right, thanks. I just want to let you know that I monitor the landfire@tnc.org mailbox and look forward to getting any communication from you at all. If you have questions or want follow-up from today's webinar, don't hesitate to drop a note there. We'll get it on to the person who needs to respond. Also, the BPS review, as Randy mentioned, is underway right now. Our first target date to receive the review of the model descriptions is June 30th. If we get your reviews in before then, we'll be able to incorporate your comments into the Landfire Remap project that's underway as well. After June 30th, we certainly welcome anything you can send us. The bottom line is we want to make these data as accurate as possible, as up-to-date as possible. We just can't guarantee that it'll be in the Remap review. So landfire@tnc.org, and if you have any questions at all about the review, you can find it on our landfirereview.org site. And a reminder, you can always send me an email.
Okay, thanks, Jeannie. I want to address a question that Jerry asks. Will the BPS review be used in the Landfire Remap, and will input continue to be accepted after the remap? So a couple of things I want to point out here. Every 2 years, Landfire does a refresh where we update the previous Landfire data sets based on user-submitted disturbance, change detection, and whatever else we can get our hands on to refresh the data set. So if you have, say, a ponderosa pine forest in 2010, and in 2009, there was a replacement fire noted on that ponderosa pine forest. In the 2010 data set, it might be changed over to be a grassland or herbaceous type. So we do not remap the whole area, we refresh it. We do have planned an upcoming remap where we'll use the latest technology that we can get our hands on, such as Landsat 8, which would be an improvement over the Landsat 7 data we used previously. We're talking about using LiDAR where possible. And so, yes, we are planning to remap the biophysical settings, at least in some areas where we have reason to do so. And a reason means that we've got enough information on how we can make that data set better that makes it worthwhile. For example, Jed Munier of the Wisconsin DNR and his collaborators there have provided tons of valuable information on how we can improve the biophysical settings in the Great Lakes using new data sets such as the soil fertility and soil drainage indices. So yes, the BPS review information, as far as I know, will go into the LANDFIRE remap where possible. Then so philosophically, we do hope to continue improving the BPS models and descriptions into the future. The way we delivered them last time, they were sort of locked down. So we submitted them and poof, they were out there, and that was that. In the future, we're talking about maybe delivering the descriptions as a wiki or something a little more living, so they can be improved more frequently, and it's more of a community. But I don't know the specifics of how that'll work yet. So great question, Jerry. If you have ideas, great. Since so many things are tied together in LANDFIRE, it's a real challenge, because if we remapped biophysical settings and then someone made a big change to the northern pine oak biophysical setting description and model, we could not go in as quickly and make a change to the spatial data set. In fact, we might not make a change at all, so things become sort of decoupled. So it's a huge machine, and we really have to think through the consequences of changes. But yeah, sort of a long answer, Jerry, but I hope that helps. Any other questions? Well, I guess that if there aren't any other questions, we can close this out and encourage you to contact us. I also want to note there are some big LANDFIRE users on the participants list. I see Amanda Swearingen's on the list. She has done tons of work with the LANDFIRE biophysical settings models in Wisconsin, and is a real specialist in making those models work with TELSA, sort of the spatial way of using the models. And there are other people on the call as well. So there's a great community, and we could definitely connect you with other people outside of our team as needed. So thanks so much for joining in today. And I think, Jack, any final words?
I just want to thank you guys again for hosting this and doing this for the Lake State.